Hello, everybody, and welcome to Building Bridges, Discovering Your Path to Peace. Our very special guest today is Don Kane. He's from Halifax, Nova Scotia. He's an author, a researcher, an educator, and an IT professional. I'll put my glasses on to read all of his qualifications. Don taught the business of being an artist for the Extensions Department of the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design. He was the second executive director for Visual Arts Nova Scotia and edited the Visual Arts News. He has written articles for Halifax Magazine, and his poetry has been published in Red Book Magazine. He is also a founding member of both the Cultural Federation of Nova Scotia and the Software Industry Association of Nova Scotia. Now, Don is here today as an author, the author of SPIES, Espionage, and Explosions, the true story behind the 1917 Halifax Explosion. And when I read your book, Don, I was just blown away with the information and the historical perspective that you have given for all of us to be enlightened. So can you tell us a little bit, first of all, welcome Don Kane to Building Bridges.
Thank you very much. I'm really pleased to be here, and I really enjoy your shows.
Thank you. And for all of those of you who don't know me, I'm Maxine Silva, your host for today. So Don, tell me, how did you get involved writing such a novel?
Well, it started a long time ago in my youth when I was with my father, and he kind of directed me to information about the Halifax Explosion. But I've really been interested in history for a long time, and it's interesting to be involved with your program because your program is about peace. And to me, history is like who we are and why we're here. And it's just basically it's about the past. But history is also about the present. When you think of my book, and I'm talking way back, the turn of the century, 1900s, and World War I, and then we've gone through World War II and other wars. But yet, with each war, like especially in the European countries where the major two wars took place, afterwards we had to befriend each other. And it's so amazing to see what history teaches to us when we get back together after the wars are over and realize how much damage we've done as opposed to how much friendship we should have caused. Wars should never exist.
Yeah. Well, this whole thing, I gather, started with your father and a question you had asked him as a young boy, and his revealing answer sort of was the impetus, lit the spark in you to write this book.
Well, it surprised me because my start of this whole thing was when I was a kid, and I was a caddy for my father at the golf course over Ashburn Golf Course in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And I was caddying for him, and I turned to him when he was with his three buddies, and I'm kind of in the background as a caddy, and I said, "What'd you do in the war, Dad?" What father is really going to tell you that,
Sure.
What they did in a war? So, But he turned to me and he said, "Well, I was a spy in the Second World War, and the Halifax explosion wasn't an accident."
Wow.
And that started my curiosity, thinking. And then through my life, I've had chances at being in archives. One, when I was working with the National Museums of Canada on their Discovery train, I was researching material to go on their train, but I kept myself busy by looking up old pictures of Halifax and the Halifax Explosion. And I came across information that indicated that the Halifax Explosion wasn't an accident, it was actually caused. And then I kept on going from there, and I've been in archives, over in Washington and the United States and Boston, went over to Europe and England, and I was in German archives and Irish archives and Austrian archives. But I spent 40 years of my life researching this before I actually sat back and looked at what I had.
Well, you were saying in your book that it was the Kaiser Wilhelm II who had an interest in coming into North America during the First World War, and he wanted to usurp everything here. How did that work?
Well, when you get right down to it, like in 1900s, Germany was actually sharpening its claws to, clench its hands on North America resources and supplies. And he was sending, the Kaiser was actually sending Irish spies over to Canada, United States, to oversee an espionage network, which I found out through all my research files, which was really interesting. And like he was doing stuff in the 1990s or 1900s, and before that, where he actually, started doing research back in kind of the 1860s, 1870s. He started then and started figuring out if there was going to be a war, how should Germany approach it? And he saw North America as either an ally or a partner. And he had plans to invade North America, but he didn't really want to invade North America to take it over. What he wanted to do was to get the United States to join him on his side and support him in the battles that they were working towards. But he actually got his generals to devise a plan to invade America, and there was 3 or 4 different plans where they were going to invade in Boston and Washington and New York City and up through Canada. Developing all the history was really quite interesting. And the book actually took a turn as well when I was researching it. I thought, because of what my father said and the files I had, it was going to be a book about the Halifax Explosion. But with all the files that I gathered over the years, when I was researching the thing for 40, 50 years, I closed down one of my IT companies, and I was sitting on the porch reading books, and then decided I was going to write my novel. And when I started going through the files, I realized that, this is more than just a history of, the Halifax Explosion. And what I found out that the files were taking me through what the Kaiser had done, and setting up all these things from the 1900th century through to before the war started, and what he was trying to accomplish. And so the book took a turn, and it started out with in 1915. There was an explosion in Seattle where there was a vessel there that was loaded with munitions that were starting to go over to the Russian front to support them. And then after that, in 1915 through to 1917, he was the Germans and his espionage teams were blowing up bridges and munition plants all across North America. And then in the year before the Halifax explosion, the Black Tom explosion took place, which was an explosion in the New York harbor where the munition on the vessels docked at a supply dock, which were going to go over to Europe. The same spies are involved with the Halifax explosion and the Seattle explosion. And the next one I'm going to be talking to, we're all tied in with the same names turning up in the same places. The next one that happened was everybody in Canada, when they're growing up, believes that the Parliament buildings was an accident. And this same group of people actually caused the destruction of the Canadian Parliament buildings. And then the year after the the Parliament buildings explosion, it takes you into the Halifax explosion down here in Nova Scotia. So the book kind of tied from my start at the beginning, where my father said I was a spy in the Halifax, in the Second World War, and the Halifax explosion was an accident. And then after the research, I realized that, no, God, it's Germany invading.
No accident, right? Yeah.
No, but it was Germany invading North America, and the Halifax explosion was just one of the elements.
Now, you said in your book that there were approximately 1,900 Germans living in Canada at that time, which was, in the US, was it? In the US. And that was actually greater than the population in Canada. Did I get that wrong?
No, you get it right. Right at the front of the book, one of the things I point out, or in front of the internet site, the population of Germans in the United States was equal to the total population of Canada. So wow. If the Germans had have supported, if the Kaiser had got the support from the United States, and the Germans that were living in the United States had walked across the Canadian border, they'd be sitting down in our tavern saying, You know, you want to be on our team? Because at that time, you know, the Canadian population was a large population was, you know, German oriented, especially in the Western provinces and all the Slavic countries out there, which were speaking German languages. There was an awful lot of Germans.
Yes.
And in both cases during the First World War, both the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of the country had this battle working out between themselves where, like, these people are really Americans or Canadians, but you know, we really do have to figure out, are they on our side or are they supporting the German side? And it was a twist in both levels of, you know, and a lot of German Canadians went off to fight for the German, for Canada. But then
Is that right? Oh, I didn't know that. Is that right? How interesting is that?
And then a lot of, you know, not a lot, but then Germans also went back to the homelands and fought on the German side. And the same thing was happening in the United States, where you had this double feeling. I mean, what do you do? Like, you know, as a German family, you know, you're coming over to Canada or North America, and, you know, maybe in the 1700s, and by then your generation of family is really North American. And then, and all of a sudden the Kaiser is asking for friendship around the world and support us. Like, do you support your own country or do you country you're living in, or do you go back to your mother country or father country and say, gee, maybe we should be supporting them?
Yes, absolutely. So the allegiances were blurred, more or less.
But that brings up, you know, kind of what you're battling with, you know, like, let's have peace around the world.
Yeah.
Where when you realize now, Canada is a wonderful nation because we let so many immigrants in. And the immigrants that come here love to be Canadians.
Yes.
So, but yet still they do have ties back to their own countries, and you've got to realize that it must be hard for them to give up everything and become a Canadian, but they do.
Well, you know, but at the same time, Canadians Canada allows those different cultures to maintain their heritage through different cultural events and maintaining a language, and all of those things that are encouraged. So it's vive la différence, but we are all one, and like a patchwork quilt.
I am so proud to be a Canadian, and as far as I'm concerned, we should allow more ethnic communities come into our country, because the only thing it does for us is expand our horizons of connections to the world, and the people that are coming are really intelligent people, and they want to be here, and they're workers. Absolutely. They do things.
And I'm proud to be a Canadian for the same reason, Don, you know, plus others, but it's wonderful. So what's interesting to me is Halifax. The port of Halifax was a strategic point during the First World War, for sure. Can you explain why?
Well, Halifax has always been a strategic point in North America. Like, when you start at the beginning, like you start in the 1700s, 1600s, when the fishermen were coming over, when they get on their boats in Europe, we're the closest landlocked area. So they come here first, because when you're on one of their vessels, it's like 6 to 7 days. So they're always stopping in Halifax first. So Halifax became a major port. They would come here first, then go down to Boston, then they get down to New York. Right. But Halifax became a major port because of our Bedford Basin, where it had a very sheltered, protected harbor, which was valuable to in the wintertime to kind of hide in and go through the winters before we actually went out into the spring seasons. And during the wars, that's where they stockpiled the vessels to gather to, from there, go into the convoys that were going over to Europe to support the European problems.
I see. Well, actually, into the Second World War, Halifax was a strategic port as well. And after the war, my mother was a war bride. We came from England, and we came to Pier 21 when I was just a baby after the war. And you know, but now over the years, and we're a little bit off course here, but this is important to say, over the years, Halifax has lost its position of strategy for seafaring folks, and that's too bad. Why did that happen?
Well, basically because what it amounts to is Halifax is in North America the end of all communication routes. So when you're losing, like we gained the power at the beginning because all of the North American activities were taking place along the coast, and then from there we are going into the St. Lawrence River to ship stuff down there.
Yeah.
But when you actually think of the value now of having the container ships coming here, what they have to do then is train them out of here up to through our borders, through Maine, and then up to either central Canada or down into the United States. And so like we are becoming, again, because of the container boats becoming another value. But think of it the other way around. Think of it from the IT industry. In the IT industry, Halifax became really important because Boston, in its first trials of the internet, came from Boston up to Nova Scotia. So we became the first IT industry structure in North America that was really valuable. Then the lines came in from Central Canada. But when you get those two factors coming in there, what happened in the IT industry is because we were the first people to get the internet, we leapt forward and learned all these new things to do with the IT industry. But yet when we moved into Central Canada and even into the United States, they were still 1 or 2 years behind. I'll give you an example. I had in my IT business in Purdy's Wharf, we were doing kiosks, and the internet would actually go a line directly to the kiosk, so it was directly connected to the internet. When I went up to Toronto to set up the kiosk structures for the front entrance buildings in the high rises there, my comment to them was, all we need is a dedicated IT line to go into the machine. And all of a sudden you had these people who were supposed to be more intelligent and richer and higher in technology and knowledgeable in the industry were saying, what's a direct line? You know, so we had to teach them about the internet and how direct lines coming into large buildings. So Halifax, you know, once again became, because it was at the end of the communication link, but yet birthed itself with the first strength of the internet, it became a valuable asset, which then transformed our teams down to California and up to Ottawa, where the IT people moved, the strength of the IT people moved from here up into the areas that were hiring for the next level of development.
Yeah, so now, as I'm gathering you're saying, the IT industry is now bringing Halifax to the point of being recognized as an important center again. And my understanding, again, correct me if I'm wrong, is that when the St. Lawrence Seaway opened up, a lot of maritime traffic was directed to Upper Canada and bypassed the Maritimes, more or less. So now, coming round to the IT industry, which is something that is critical to our survival at this point in time for sure, Halifax will be in a position, and is in a position, of prominence once more.
Well, yes and no. Now, what I was talking about was the IT industry growth up to the year 2000 through to about 2010, you know, in that area.
Yeah.
And, okay, now you're at a point where it doesn't make a difference in the IT industry where you are in the world. If you do not aim your product into an international market, whether you be living in Halifax, Nova Scotia, or up in the Yukon, or in Chicago, or New York City. So it's flipped again into the next level of you have to bridge into international marketing, which is back into the point that we were talking about how valuable the having people from around the world coming to our country, because all of a sudden you get those people who are linked to people all around the world, and they're the ones that are helping us step with our products into an international market. And the more we get, more international people we get to come to Canada, the better off we are.
And the better off is the world. And now getting back to 1917 explosion in Halifax, and it was contrived. It was something that was planned, and the Kaiser, Wilhelm II, was behind this more or less, and he had help in Canada and in the US to make this happen. Now, I understand also in Newfoundland, which is where a lot of the German submarines were coming and actually getting supplies from Newfoundland, that there's a very interesting story there about the Catholic Church.
Now you're flipping into three levels there. The Catholic Church getting involved is up in the Parliament buildings. I'll go through that story first. One of the interesting things that's covered in the book, there's five major incidences. I'll go over them again. What you've got is you've got the thing happening out in Seattle in 1915. Okay, where you got munition plants. You've got the 1915, 1917, where they're blowing up munition plants and bridges right across Canada, United States.
Now, these were the same group of spies who were coordinating this, right? They were American and Canadian. Yeah,
yes,
is that true?
And the spies are being paid by the Germans, and it's basically Germans backed by the Irish and the Indian and Russian facets in the United States and Canada. Now you're up to like the
these are the Indians from India. This is more or less, I think, the Sikh community, was it not? I think
so. Yeah, they had their strength in there.
Yeah.
So that leads us up to the 1918, where you get into the Black Tom explosion in New York City. Then the book continues into the Canadian Parliament building, which is what you were talking about with the priests. In the 1916, they were the Canadian Parliament buildings. One of the generals was asked by the Prime Minister to go out and figure out, was the Parliament buildings really an accident, or was it like something more? Should we be looking into this?
And Don, just very quickly, for the people who don't understand, why were they going to bomb the Parliament buildings?
Well, they were trying to, at that time, what they were trying to do, both in Canada and United States, the Germans, what they were trying to do was they were trying to keep Canada and the United States occupied in their own country, so they would be busy in their own country, so they wouldn't be spending time in developing and organizing supplies that would be sent over to support the German attack.
It sounds familiar, like today, Don.
Yeah. The more they kept us busy, and attacking the Parliament buildings was a major concern. You think of New York with the World Trade Center. So he had this general go out and figure out, what are we being? Is this just an accident or what? And the general went out, and it took him 4 to 5 months to actually go through everybody and figure out what was going on. And his report comes back, and this report is sitting in the National Archives of Canada. It's never been released yet in any other facet. My book was the first one to release it. And basically he came back and said, this was caused. Here's the people that are involved. Here's how they got into the city of Halifax. Here's how they got into the Parliament buildings. Here's what they knew about the Parliament buildings. And then, as you say, Catholic priests. There was actually Catholic priests at that time supporting them, what they did is they supported how to bring the espionage agents into the city of Halifax, where they could safely stash them off and support them, where they could get munitions. And then after that, they helped them get away from the Ottawa area so they could continue doing other espionage agent activity throughout North America. And what's interesting about this is all of the priests' names are whited out in this report.
Interesting, eh? Wow. Wow, so much, my God.
The Catholic Church has an amazing espionage.
Now, you know what, regarding the explosion itself that took place in the harbor in 1917, why did people think it was an accident and not something that was contrived? I mean, sure, there have to have been people who knew, like your father as an example, right?
Well, my father didn't know, but there were Kane people in Military District 6 at that time of the Halifax explosion, and I've got documentation of them being in the military headquarters in the Secret Service area. But we'll get into a couple things here. Let's talk about what you were talking about in Newfoundland. In Newfoundland, they were using Newfoundland as a supply base for their submarines, and they had supply depots throughout Newfoundland, and they would come into Newfoundland, stock up with their fuels, come through the Halifax area, and they were destroying ships off the city of Halifax. And then when they were going down to Boston and New York and and supply, destroying ships there.
Yeah.
And what you had there was the American British ambassador, Cecil Spring Wright. He was based in Washington, but half his time was spent in Newfoundland because the Germans had so much activity happening in Newfoundland that he was tracking down and stopping ploys of what we just talked about and other issues that were occurring in Newfoundland, because they were also doing secret activities to find out what the British were doing in North America as well. Newfoundland is at that time part of the British Empire,
Right.
and the British espionage agents and Secret Service was in Newfoundland. The Canadian Secret Service agents were based in Halifax on the Niobe. So what you have is the Spring Rice agent continually. He had people working with him throughout Canada, United States, and he also had the Pinkerton working with him to discover issues of espionage that were taking place in both countries. And between the three agencies, the Germans were just as good as the Americans. Like all three sides were incredible at how they did things and how they tracked things back and forth.
Amazing.
But the actual Halifax explosion, the Kaiser had plans that he had developed 2 decades before the World War I. He had sent kind of an imperialistic sights on the Americas, and he wanted to establish a presence there, not to put just to put U.S. in its place. And he wanted to attack it and invade it, but he didn't know whether he was capable at that time, whether he could get that far by conquering Europe and then getting into North America. But he still had his German team and generals develop plans of how to attack North America in the Boston area, New York, and Washington. And they had 3 or 4 plans that they had established and were willing to go through with, but never got around to actually accomplishing. And then when you get down to it, the Halifax explosion, my belief is that both the Prime Minister of the country, Prime Minister of Canada, and the President of the United States knew that something was going to happen on the east coast of United States or Canada, and they were preparing for that. And
so they knew prior to the happening itself that it was going to occur?
I believe they do. Now, what it amounts to is if you sit with me with all my files, and I actually get to go through all the files, there's enough historical tidbits back and forth where you can lead it up to, my God, there's a pretty good story here of what's happening.
But you know what, Don, why would the Canadians and the Americans be, if they knew ahead of time, why would they not have intervened?
Okay, let's go back to the start of the war. In the start of the war, what you had was Russia sank a German vessel off Russia, off Germany, in the Baltic Seas there. And one of the things that they discovered was one of the guys on board was working in the German embassy and was returning back to Germany, and they found his secret reports, which explained how to break the codes of what the Germans were sending over to North America. And what the Russians did is they passed that information through to the British, and then so that meant the British at the beginning of the war had the secret codes of how to interpret German messages.
Oh.
First thing the British did was cut the wires from Germany through to North America. Then the Germans worked out an agreement with the Americans that they could pass their encrypted messages through Britain, but Britain picked up on all of the messages going through so that they were interpreting everything. So now when you get back into your story of, why didn't they stop what was happening in Halifax, but you got to realize that when there's a war going on, if the Germans are realizing it, if they knew that the Germans were going to do something up in Halifax and it was stopped, then what happens to all of the secret stuff that they're passing off in Europe? If they can interpret messages in North America, the Germans are going to pick up pretty fast that their codes are being broken and they can't get away with certain things. But and I don't know whether the Prime Minister or the President knew whether something was going to happen in the New England states or Canada. but they were preparing for, in the New England states, they were doing maneuvers off the coast, up and down through to New York and Boston. And then up in Halifax, they actually had a military ship. U.S. had sold the British a military vessel, which was a hospital vessel. It was parked in the Halifax harbor before the Halifax explosion. And then before the Halifax explosion took place, two U.S. Coast Guard ships were sent up to Halifax, and they arrived in Halifax before the Halifax explosion. And aboard the two Coast Guard cutters, one of them was headed by the top medical person for the Coast Guard, and he had his team on board. And then the second vessel had the head teacher of the Coast Guard medical teams on another vessel that was coming up to Halifax.
So in preparation, just in case type thing?
I would believe, and but again, there's all I know is that they were coming and they were in the harbor at the time of the Halifax explosion. There's no piece of paper I found yet that says this is the real reason. But then the espionage acts of like World War I and World War II basically meant that after you have meetings about these various situations that are occurring, everybody in the meeting is sworn by secrecy that you cannot in your lifetime or in the lifetimes in the future ever tell people what we discussed in these meetings. Sure. So if you're trying to find these documents, they just don't exist. Like Camp X was in Canada. It was set up here by the British, and it was set up in Canada because Britain didn't want the Germans to invade England and find out how they were teaching their secret spies. And the guy who was in charge of Camp X, who was based in the United States, as soon as the war was over, all of the Camp X files were just burnt and destroyed. Much like if the secrets about the Halifax explosion ahead of time was actually known, all of those files would have been destroyed as well.
Well, Don, it's almost miraculous that you have discovered all of this information through your research or through heroic efforts, actually, and 40 plus years of going through all kinds of files all over the world, right? And in the day of internet that we're in, some of that is made accessible even to anybody who cares to look for it.
Yes, that's true. I'll go into and answer that in a minute. I just want to tidy up that last discussion I had. As well as the stuff being shipped up from the New England states, I also have Canadian documents where in Halifax, the military is sending information up to Ottawa after the Halifax explosion, which basically is confirming the fact that the hospital ship is there ahead before the Halifax explosion, and the U.S. Coast Guard boats are actually in the harbor. And he's confirming the fact that these vessels are in our harbor. So it sure indicates that there was a belief that there was the possibility that something could happen here.
Yeah, it's like putting the dots together, then the pieces of the puzzle, and then you see the whole picture, or at least partially anyway, that would lead you to believe like, there was something going on here. So regarding the explosion again, when the two ships collided, it was not supposed to happen the way it happened. There was a whole scenario that had been devised prior to, right? And then it went awry.
Yeah, but there's along with all my documentation, I've got files that basically explain that the Germans had bought land from the Boston area right through the New England states and then over to Nova Scotia to set up farms where they could put up telegraph lines going from the New England states and Washington up, so that they could confirm information as boats were going up along the coastline. So they actually had a telegraph operating system that was functioning all through the time of the First World War. And then the days of the going into the Halifax explosion, when you had the EMO who was coming, or sorry, the Mont Blanc coming up from the United States, they were aware that the Mont Blanc wasn't going to get into the harbor because the submarine nets were going to be closed. So the Halifax explosion, according to what I've gathered, should have actually taken place the day before rather than the day it actually took place. And when the EMO is in the harbor, it's supposed to be supplied with fuel, and then from there leave the harbor the day before the Halifax explosion. But because they knew that the Mont Blanc wasn't going to get through, the German espionage agents somehow stopped the supplying of the vessel, so therefore it couldn't leave in its position.
So they delayed a day to
Yes.
get the Mont Blanc into the harbor.
And then the first thing in the morning, the vessel got loaded, and then from there it could move from the point where it is in the Bedford Basin in the Rockingham area through to the Narrows. So at the same time, you've got the nets opening in the other end, and you've got this mysterious boat that no one talks about in any of the research. Well, it's mentioned, but not really clarified in any way. And that's the U.S. Clara. The U.S. Clara was a U.S. vessel pulling a couple barges, and when the nets opened, it was the first vessel to go through the nets. And because it was towing barges, it moved in and towards the Halifax side. This forced the Mont Blanc to go to the right-hand side and go up the Dartmouth side of the coast. And then the U.S. Clara kept on going along the Dartmouth side, or the Halifax side, and got up to the Narrows. And by the time the EMO had gotten from one side of the basin to the other, it crossed the EMO's pass, forcing it to go into the Dartmouth side. So by those movements, again, I believe it's controlled by the German espionage teams that they had. It forced both boats to be on the Dartmouth side, and then from there they're coming at each other. And my belief is that Kaiser, a long time ago, had set up the fact that this was going to actually happen. And when you think of the historical maps of Halifax, when you look at the maps of Halifax, especially if you're in Europe, it looks like the Narrows is a small little spot. So that if it could blow up the Narrows, then they could stop this convoy basin issue.
Oh, wow.
And then where they actually forced the boat to hit was exactly where I believe they planned it to hit, because when it hit the dock and exploded there, the explosion actually takes place going down into the water and up into the air, and then from the air across the landmass. But where the boat actually hit was quite close to where the British had their munitions plant to supply all their vessels and load all their oils and supplies for the ships that they had. And what I believe they wanted was to have that first accident take place, and then with the blowing up of the British munition plants, then that would have actually been as big as or bigger than the explosion itself that occurred, which would have flattened the land, because it would have been a land explosion, which would have destroyed all of Halifax.
Wow. And so the people of the city were collateral damage, and all the buildings and whatever, they just wanted, didn't matter, right? They just wanted to flatten the whole area as a message, or what? You think? You don't know, I know, but I mean.
But basically, what you got to think about what's happening over in Europe. It's being completely destroyed, city after city after city. So blowing up a city in North America, that's just an extension of war.
I understand.
Especially when that's a major port that's being used to move the supplies from North America over to Europe. But let me keep on talking about the Halifax explosion a little bit more. You had the Halifax explosion taking place, which was quite large and flattened everything. You got the savior of the British munition plants that didn't blow up. So, and then the trial starts to figure out what's going on with this whole issue. And the trial starts basically in December. In January, there is another explosion at the same point or another a boat on fire, which had as much munitions as the Mont Blanc did. And it was on fire, and it was in the same places where the two boats had crashed. And the only reason it didn't explode was there was a team of Dartmouth men that rode from the shore and came out and put out the fire. Wow. But that was a second explosion of the Halifax explosion. And then at the end of the trial, in the south end of the city, where the train tracks have been moved because the train station had been destroyed in the north end, and they had been developing a train path back to the south end of the city to make a better port development. They developed that during the trial period, and at the last part of the trial, there was another explosion there where there was another boat being loaded with munitions, which I believe the German espionage team actually caused as well.
Wow, amazing. So Don, obviously some of this information, or all of the information that you've discovered, has been available to others. Why hasn't anybody written this story before?
My belief is twofold. One, I stuck to my horses and spent 40 to 50 years finding bits of paper, and what I thought I was researching was Halifax Explosion, and then what it turned out to was the 5 events that I talked about. But where it really came into kind of a growth in the whole thing was the expansion of when the internet started getting online. And during the last part of my research, what they did is they released 2 things which really supported, and in the documentation I had, all of a sudden I was getting 2 really valid sources from the internet. One was they finally released the Kaiser's files, and that took place, probably 4 to 5 years ago. So it just got released recently. And when I started digging into his files and whether they really had these files to attack North America, there they were. And there was back up to my belief, oh my God, what I actually found on the Canadian or North American side is being reconfirmed through his documents. And then the second thing that happened was that the German spies that I've got tied up in these things, and the major guy is Johansson. His name is tied up in all 5 of the events where I've got documentation. He's actually mentioned in 3 of them, but then the team of Germans that he's working with, who are mentioned in all 5, are cross-referencing. So he's tied to all 5 of these events. He actually turns up in the next level of information that was let out, which was just released at the end of my pre-writing the book, was the Pinkerton Files. And Pinkerton Files, Pinkerton was a secret agency for United States. And what I found in the Black Tom explosion is he was involved in the Black Tom explosion, Johansson, and in the Pinkerton Files, there's a whole bunch of files back and forth.
That was in New York, right? Was that in New York?
Yeah, it was in New York on the New Jersey side. But in the Pinkerton Files, his name is brought up 2 or 3 times in their reports. So all of a sudden you get another Secret Service agency giving me information to support what I found in the Canadian and the European files. So these names that I'm talking about can be cross-referenced. Now, when you get into why hasn't it been done before, I would say twofold. One is no one has stuck to researching the depth that I have researched. And then the second thing is we get the internet having the ability to access more files internationally where we are sharing things, or more things have been moved from pieces of paper to photostats to digitized, articles, so that you don't have to travel all the way to the archives. And a lot of the time when you go to the archives, you're kind of asking for a piece of paper. It takes you 3 or 4 days to get the piece of paper, and you kind of miss the mark of what you're after. So the time it took for me to go and find all these little individual pieces of paper is being sped up because of the internet.
Amazing, amazing. So how have people responded to your novel, to your story, and have they raised an eyebrow? I mean, what's the reaction?
Well, you've got to believe that nobody wants to believe in the President of the United States, nor the Prime Minister of the country. Neither one of them want to admit that we had German activities in North America in the First World War, Second World War, and even in today's society, the public isn't told about this information. So it's always a hidden source that nobody wants to know about it. And then when you get into the Halifax area, the people here have been following the fact that the Halifax explosion was always an accident. So for me to come up and say it's not an accident, I'm bumping into this incredible stone wall fence, which basically says, you know, you're building a really interesting story.
Yeah.
It's hard to believe. And my challenge back to them is, first of all, read the book. Then second of all, go through the archival files in the back of the book.
Check it out, right?
And then at the end of it, you know, I'm quite willing to sit down with anybody and sit there on a one-on-one basis and go through the files I have and say, take a look at this or take a look at that. But then the other underlying factor is I'm not a historian, right? So when I wrote the book, I wrote it as a historical novel, not a, this is what actually happened in history. So you get these people saying, well, you're just calling it a historical novel, so it's just a story. But when you get right down to it, one of the guys at the Nova Scotia Archives, who I value incredibly, who I thought was just going to tear the book apart, he summed up the story by saying, you know, this book is really interesting, and it is really an incredible yarn. Now, what he means by the word yarn is interesting, because when you actually look at the book, there's so much content of history there that you really have to go through it 2 or 3 times to actually get all the tidbits of the real history.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then when you get into the yarn level, you realize that I'm covering from the time of the 1860s through to 1930s. So I had to build it into a story of characters across so much time.
Sure, absolutely, absolutely. Well, that's amazing. And before we go, is there anything you would like to add, Don, that you want people to know regarding all of these 40+ years of research and your resulting novel, Spies, Espionage, and Explosions?
Well, I can sum it up by saying I had a really, really fun time doing all the research. Then I had a really enjoyable time writing the book, because I had so much content that my editors kept on going, get rid of this, get rid of that, put it on the website. You got too many pages. The book will never sell because it's 700 pages. It should be down at 200. Get rid of information. And then, but now I'm having as much fun marketing the book as I am in the other 2 levels, because I'm bumping into these issues that you're talking about, where people are saying, no, it can't be true. We don't want to believe you, because that's going to change history all over the world. But I have done 2 things. I've offered all my files to the Nova Scotia Archives. They have not yet accepted them, but what it amounts is I hope to get them in a public position, so that in the future, if other researchers want to go through all the files I have, that people have access to them. And then the second thing I will bring up is we've developed a website, which is halifaxexplosion.ca, where people can go onto the website and look at the information that we didn't include in the book. And there's also information about, you know, what happens if Germany during the First World War, it didn't occur. You know, what would happen to that whole area of Europe? And there's consideration there from a lot of historians. So I put together a website to give more information about the surrounding historical content of the time zone I'm talking about, as well as just the book itself. And then I'm slowly putting on more of the archival files, so that people won't have to go all the way to either Ottawa or down to the United States to actually access these files.
Wonderful. Well, you've done all the hard work, Don, and it's available there. So there you go, folks. There's the book. And we will have all of Don's contact information when you view this video. And I'm sure that he would be amenable to anybody contacting him for more information and where else we can take this, because I think this is really valuable stuff. And I congratulate you and applaud you, Don, for coming up with such an amazing book.
Well, I appreciate the time you've given me. I'm going to sum it up by saying the book is on Amazon. It's on all the chapters, Barnes Noble, And you can get it by going to the website, which is halifaxexplosion.ca. But one of the things that people should realize that history is really important. If you think about the history of the past and start teaching your children about what occurs in your neighborhood and how things should change and develop into a future world, I think that is what you're talking about in your video casts here. And I think everybody should be applauding you for what you're doing, because the more we get to be sharing back and forth, is a
Well, that's the whole objective, you know. We're all one here. We're all sharing our stories, and we all have a story to tell. And I'm grateful for all of those people who participate. And you particularly, Mr. Don Kane, today. Thank you, thank you, thank you. All of the contact information, as I said, will be shared so people will know how to be in touch and buy your book. Yeah. So, namaste, my friend. Have a beautiful day, and thank you.